It's my pleasure now to introduce today's speaker, Thi Nguyen, who's Associate Professor of Philosophy at the University of Utah. Thi works at a very interesting intersection of a number of areas of philosophy that are not typically brought together. So he works in aesthetics and philosophy of action and epistemology all at the same time. I think of him as somebody whose diverse research interests are nevertheless unified by a particular focus on autonomy and being self-directed, and yet at the same time on questions of trust and when we can rely on others. I'd like to recommend to everybody who hasn't already read it Thi's fantastic book, Games, Agency as Art, which is a really terrific exploration of a lot of topics that are also fun, and I hope we'll have. I'm sure we'll have some of that fun today, as well as some terrific philosophical depth. So, without any further ado, Thi, the floor is yours. Looking forward to what you have to say. Oh, and can I just interject that sometimes we have questions going on during the talk. But I'm going to ask people to actually hold on to their questions until the end of the talk, and after 45 minutes, we can jump in and ask things. So, Thi, it's all yours. Looking forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thanks, Jennifer. Did I ever tell you, Jennifer, that I figured out recently a better articulation of why I do aesthetics and philosophy of art and social epistemology? So I think one way to think about it is that aesthetics and the philosophy of art has been a long study in the history of how technology changes how we communicate. And every bit of philosophy of art is like narrowly focused intensely on how a slight change in the medium of communication changes its potentials radically. Anyway, thanks so much for that introduction. I'm going to share my screen. How's that look? Look good? Awesome.
That looks great.
Okay, so the talk I'm giving today is actually the first thing that is kind of the full intersection of two of like the major parts of my research life. So one part of my research life, I do social epistemology, and I worry about the social nature of knowledge and the communal nature of knowledge building. And back in my PhD thesis, I was obsessed with a particular problem that at the time, nobody else I could get interested in. And that was the problem of, I call it the expert finding problem. That is, how does a non-expert properly identify which expert to trust, given that they don't have adequate expertise? This is actually a problem that's in Socrates. And at the time I was like, this seems so important. And I couldn't convince anyone, and then it kind of sat on the back burner until I think the world caught up, and then a lot of people have now realized this is a deeply important issue. The other thing that I've been working on is this 8-year project on the nature of games, and I think it'll help to background this to explain a little bit about the stuff about games. So I was trying to figure out what makes games unique. A lot of the work about why games are special and games are an art form really spent a lot of time talking about how games are like fictions or movies and don't talk about what's special about gameplay. And I was trying to figure out what's special about games, and I found this quote from my favorite game designer. I'm geeky enough to have a favorite game designer. He's Rainer Knizia. He's the genius of German board game design. And he said, the most important tool in the game designer's toolkit is the point system, because the point system tells the players what to care about. And so if you're a game player, you're like, yeah, obviously that makes perfect sense. Games tell you what to care about. And if you're a philosopher that works in practical reasoning and value theory, what you think is, holy shit, games tell you what to care about, and we just do it, right? We just look at a game and it tells us what to care about. So one of the spin-offs of that project became a worry, and that worry was about the intense seductiveness of clarified point systems. So at the end of the games book, I introduced a concept, and it's everything I've been working on for the last 3 or 4 years. And the concept is value capture. So value capture is what happens when your values are rich and subtle or in the progress of developing. And then the world puts you in a context where it shows you a very simplified and typically quantified version of that value. Citation rates, H-index, Twitter likes, for students, GPA. And so I began worrying about what happened when we absorbed large-scale institutional metrics. And in another paper, one of the things I ended up arguing is that the best way to conceive of this harm is that it counts as a kind of outsourcing. And in particular, a lot of the times you're outsourcing your values to Mark Zuckerberg or the makers of Fitbit or the US News and World Report and whoever makes the law school rankings, right? So that's the large background worry. And the paper I'm about to give you started as a footnote in that paper that kind of grew into like a 15,000 word thing of its own, and then realized that it was connected to this worry about finding experts. So that's the background. Here's the paper. So this paper really starts for me, as I had all these issues swirling around, with finding this moment from Onora O'Neill. So Onora O'Neill was a famous Kantian ethicist and is a famous Kantian ethicist and a famous bioethicist, one of the originators of the field. And this is from her extraordinary BBC Lectures on Trust. And I found this moment really compelling. And as far as I could tell, no one had picked up on this moment. And this is all we have on this topic from her. She says, transparency can encourage people to be less honest, so increasing deception and reducing reasons for trust. Those who know that everything they say are right is to be made public may massage the truth. Public reports may underplay sensitive information. Head teachers' employers may write blandly uninformed reports and references. Evasive and uninformative statements may substitute for truth-telling. Demands for universal transparency are likely to encourage the evasions, hypocrisies, and half-truths that we might usually call political correctness, but which might more accurately be called self-censorship or deception. So I think this is deeply right, and it's underappreciated. So what I want to do today is explicate this argument, defend the argument, and then make things worse, because I think Onora O'Neill actually underestimates the power of her argument. But I'm going to add one more piece that makes things, I think, a lot worse. So here's to there are a lot of things going on in this argument, but I want to simplify the thread that pops to the core for me. So to rephrase in my language, people think that trust and transparency go together, but they're actually deeply at odds. Transparency demands that experts justify their reasoning to non-experts, but expert reasons are incomprehensible to non-experts by their nature, and so transparency forces deception. That's her argument. Now, I want to add a wrinkle. So O'Neill's presumption is that under regimes of transparency, expert actors won't change their action, they'll simply invent false justification. My worry is that depending on the structure of the transparency, transparency can force, to varying degrees, experts to confine their reasoning or their action choice to those for which they can find some publicly available reasoning. That is, that the actions will change. So the big worry for me that goes beyond O'Neill's argument is that in different ways, in different contexts, the force of transparency can undermine expertise to varying degrees. So let me give you a few quick case studies in the history of metrics. By the way, if you don't know, there's this incredibly wonderful field of, it kind of spins off of science and technology studies, but it's kind of the history and sociology of quantification, and especially the role of quantification in large-scale institutional and political culture. For the philosophers in the room, a lot of this, even though it's not conducted in philosophy, will seem really familiar, and that's because these folks are deeply influenced by Ian Hacking and Bruno Latour, and kind of take those philosophy of science projects into a much more empirical, historical field. So here's some examples. Charity Navigator and Charity Watch. I actually used these for a long time. I think a lot of you probably know what they are. So Charity Navigator and Charity Watch are charity oversight groups. So their goal is to rate various nonprofits on how good they are at being nonprofit. So a major part of the score that's been used in Charity Navigator until very recently is throughput. So throughput is the more contributions we give to the nonprofit, the more they get through the nonprofit, the higher the rating. So the idea originally was to reduce administrative waste and internal overhead. But as it turns out, according to experts in the nonprofit sector, below a certain point, this metric forces people to cut internal costs and actually undermines the effectiveness of the evaluation. So imagine for a second that your departments were rated by the university on how little you spent internally on faculty and administration, right? This would be a disaster. But it looks good enough that people outside the nonprofit sector inspecting the metric briefly thought, this seems pretty good. It was good enough for me to use for a decade to guide my charitable donations. Here's another article. Here's another example from Sally Engelmary. Sally Engelmary is the author of this wonderful book, The Seductions of Quantification. So she's an anthropologist, and she participated in various UN committees to set various rankings of human rights. So if you know the Global Development Index, the index that rates countries on how well they're promoting human development in human rights inside their countries. But in this book, she turns her anthropologist's eye on the UN committees and kind of like opens up the door and shows you how the sausage is made on the rankings. And my students' response to reading this was that they will never trust a UN ranking again. She gives one of the most devastating examples she gives is a 2-chapter case study in the State Department's sex trafficking index. So this is the US State Department, but this becomes the primary index by which national and international governments have come to view their efforts on reducing sex trafficking. Here's the thing. The index looks solely at convictions of sex traffickers, which again, at a first glance, looks pretty good. The problem is, Mary points out, that the policing approach isn't the only available approach to reducing sex trafficking. So another approach to reducing sex trafficking is highly correlated with poverty. And if you reduce poverty in an area, the sex trafficking goes down. But if you reduce sex trafficking by economic methods, sex traffickers simply stop working and you lose convictions. So that makes sense? So if you reduce sex trafficking by reducing poverty, this shows up on our State Department's sex trafficking index as a failure. You'll be rated as doing badly at controlling sex trafficking. Again, this is an index which is actually pretty terrible for people in the space, but is good enough that it convinces passersby and lookers on that it's a good index. So these are apparently good metrics for performance, and they make sense to non-experts. But it turns out in the eyes of the experts to be a blunt instrument. So here's a way to put the worry. Transparency forces experts to be ruled by metrics that are comprehensible to non-experts. And then it can draw experts to reason using those metrics, which undermines to some significant degree some amount of their expertise. So here's another quick way to put it. If you believe in some variation of the Dunning-Kruger effect, the Dunning-Kruger effect is if you don't know, you don't know, you don't know. The worry is that public metrics write the Dunning-Kruger effect into institutional policy. Does that make sense? That if you don't know, then you don't know how bad the metric is. So here's a case study. This is how I got in this. I was for 7 years in my previous job, head of education learning outcome assessment for my department. This paper is actually, I think, kind of like catharsis and therapy for the sorrow that I endured during that period. So for those of you that don't know, education learning outcomes assessment is producing quantified, comprehensible to outsider assessments of your success in learning. So in my case, I had to find metrics that would be comprehensible and believable to the Utah State Legislature that would justify our success in educating. So here's some metrics currently in use by higher administration and educational governments. I'm not making these up. These were all used in my previous university. Graduation rate, graduation speed, employment rate and income of recently graduated students, and student satisfaction is reported on evaluations. Just want to point out right now that these are very easy to collect at an institutional level. They are collected the same way. There's no disagreement about at the institutional level, but they should also strike you as pretty thin. So for me, as a philosopher, here are things that you can't assess in learning outcomes assessment: increasing thoughtfulness, increasing self-reflection, increasing virtue, increasing humility. These are all difficult to assess in the world of objective metrics and measures. And here I'm not making some philosophical claim that they're in principle unquantifiable. I'm saying, and I'll give you more argument for this shortly, that the functional structure of public-oriented assessment metrics in large-scale institutions means these kinds of things will be left out. Okay, so here's what we're focusing on. Something I want to call assessment transparency, the directive that some process be made available for assessment for outsiders. By the way, I just want to point out there's another kind of transparency, especially in the sciences, about making your data available to other sciences. That's largely what this talk, that's not what this talk is largely about. I'll mention it briefly, but this is about the thing that we do in public institutions that's called assessment, that's called transparency, which is for the purpose of assessment. So there are two forms. One is expert transparency, which is that a process from one set of experts be made accessible to another set of experts possessing the same expertise. For example, epidemiologists making their data available for other epidemiologists to check their work. That would count as expert transparency. Public transparency is the drive that a process be made accessible by the general public or their representatives, in our system, duly elected representatives. So this is mostly going to be focused on the problems of public transparency. By the way, I know that there are a lot of computer scientists in the room, and every time I've given this talk with computer scientists in the room, they've all gotten really excited and then like torn themselves to shreds arguing about whether this applies to machine learning stuff. And what I have to say about that will be, I have no idea. I'm not a machine learning expert. I would love to hear what you think. But this starts with an analysis. This starts as a project in public transparency and thinking about data collection efforts at scale as they're carried on in large scale institutions. So public transparency is the directive that a process be made available for assessment by some general public or their representatives. So I mean available here quite robustly. That means that the process, so if I'm like a Bayesian economist and I just dump my spreadsheets online, that's not really available for public assessment. That requires significant expertise to check. So the data needs to be translated or compressed, or something has to be done to it to make it accessible by the general public. By the way, I also want to point out that even though I'm looking at assessment transparency, and there's this other thing that you do in the sciences, which is data sharing transparency, even though that's for a different purpose, I'm worried that it has some of the same problems because it can be readily repurposed. So I think a lot of you know Naomi Oreskes has written a lot about this, about how tobacco science data that was made available for data sharing was repurposed for assessment in the hands of hostile onlookers. And I just want to invite you to imagine if I said, you know what, y'all's classes are awesome. It's amazing what you're doing. So we're going to record everything you ever did in the university and put it on YouTube so the world can learn from it. And even though that's for data sharing, I think everyone who teaches here will instinctively cringe in horror because you know that that can be repurposed by people, especially misunderstanding or hostile people for assessment. Everybody who teaches ethics and social political philosophy in the age of alt-right attacks on critical race theory worries constantly about this, but I'm sure you all know that. Okay. So I just want to note that transparency is intended to and certainly does curtail corruption. I'm not denying that. My claim is that there's also a downside, and the downside is not adequately understood. So my claim isn't going to be to get rid of transparency. It's going to be to make the cost clear so that we can make a judgment about the degree of transparency that's worthwhile. So my claim is going to be that transparency is a form of aggressive surveillance. And like any other surveillance, it's valuable, effective, and costly, and it should be used judiciously. So there are two versions of the central argument. This is the one I'm going to concentrate on, the master argument. This is the expert version. So expertise often requires acting from reasons that are not available to non-experts. Some of these are explicit reasoning. Explicit reasons require training and specialized knowledge. So assessing a math proof or a logic proof requires a lot of specialized knowledge. But a lot of this is also in what people in the skills in the philosophy and psychology of skill call tacit knowledge. So skilled perception and intuition. So things like the fact that an experienced radiologist can just look at an X-ray and it'll immediately cancers will only immediately jump out at them. Or famously, pediatricians can walk into a waiting room and instantly spot which kids are quite sick as a kind of gestalt synthesis. So public transparency on expert processes demand that experts take only those actions for which they can give public justification. And this limits them to actions which can be justified in non-expert terms. So I just want to say, every time I get to the slide, this is the heart. I'm going to do the consequences, but this is the real argument. I think this argument is trivial and obvious. There's nothing, this is not Kant. This seems completely brazenly obvious and just putting together crap that we all know. And yet, to someone like me, who's raised in a culture of the more transparency, the better, at the same time, it seems startling and confusing and kind of nauseating. So I just want to note here that I don't think this argument is special. I just think it's simple, like eerily simple enough that every time I get to this talk, I get to this point and I'm like, am I actually talking about anything? Do we all already know this? This is boring. I'm sorry, but I'm going to move on. Okay. So my argument is not that going to be that there are some examples of bad metrics. I mean, with the examples I gave at the beginning, you can just say find better metrics. What I'm going to try to argue is that the essential logic of transparency, which is offering justifications that are available to all, is in tension with the logic of expertise. There's no way out of this tension. I also want to say that, so a lot of people in this case worry that I'm being elitist, and a lot of the original criticisms of things like this were based on an older conception in which some small elite class of particular people were to rule over the masses with those elite people's expertise. That's not what I'm talking about. Given that radical hyperspecialization of human knowledge, we are all non-experts in most domains, even if we're expert in some domains. So this is a problem. This would be an equal problem in a world full of PhDs. Every expert is inexpert in most things. So as an aggregate, the voting public is an expert in most things. So this is an essential problem of democracy and information aggregation. There's, by the way, details about how things aggregate that we can get into in Q&A. So how much does transparency undermine expertise? I'm going to say it depends. So there are two loci for transparency assessment, two places you could look. One is the outputs, which is justification in terms of what the process outputs, and the other is the deliberative process, justifications used in deciding which actions to take. So this is a spectrum concept. This is not a simple binary. So for example, output transparency is assessing doctors on lives saved or assessing police on cases closed. Deliberative transparency would be assessing doctors on justifications for prescribing particular drugs in terms of specified diagnostic criteria, or assessing, this is actually true from my life. My previous department was moving, the university was moving towards a situation where every line item in the budget had to be justified with data-driven demonstrations of teaching efficacy in the education learning outcomes I gave before. So that's line by line deliberative assessment. So output transparency asks that experts give justification in terms of understandable, monitorable outputs, and there's more leeway, right? You have to hit the target, but you have more leeway about how you hit the target. So for example, if we were just told to target, in the end, graduation rate and graduation speed, and we could do that in any way we wanted, right? That would be one thing. But deliberative transparency is more intrusive and gives less leeway. So another way to put it is that output transparency binds target selection to things that non-experts can understand, and deliberative transparency binds the reasoning process to what non-experts can understand. So O'Neill's assumption was that experts will act the same, but give false justifications. But for me, there are worse possibilities. Possibility one, I want to call limitation. That's that experts will limit their actions to those for which they can find some public justification. Notice this is not a bind on reasoning. This is kind of a posterior bind. So you can reason. You could reason for your own reasonings. That's a terrible way to put it. You could reason whatever way you want to certain conclusions, and then you could go back and say, well, we'll pick the target that we can find some public justification for. But even worse is guidance, which is that experts will seek or prefer to use publicly available reasons in their own deliberations about how to act. I think of this as kind of an internalization moment. So limiting transparency, so I know I've talked to a lot of doctors and psychiatrists about this. They often say that they make their diagnoses kind of gestalt and intuitively, but then they limit themselves to ones they could find some plausible diagnosis to write down for. I asked my psychiatrist friend how often that's what's actually going on. He said 90% of the time. So that's limiting transparency. Guiding transparency is when you actually target the quality itself directly. And this often happens with incentives, like rewarding university departments based on graduation speed, or rewarding police chiefs with higher salaries for higher case closure rates. This, by the way, happens, and there's a This American Life episode about it in New York that's totally terrifying. So O'Neill's deception outcome depends on a huge amount of leeway, and it presumes that the experts will take the same action under transparency that they would have taken without, and then invent alternate reasoning. But that depends on kind of ineffective monitoring. I kind of suspect that O'Neill was talking about a particular situation. She was talking about bioethics, and a lot of her examples involve doctors who make a diagnosis and then record the relevant evidence themselves. There's nobody looking over them as they record the evidence. But a lot of these cases, the evidence of success is recorded externally, right? Throughput, outcomes-driven budget requests, other departments record those, which is what you do when you're afraid of corruption or bias. So here's the basic problem. Transparent metrics can't capture expert valuing and reasoning. So the less leeway there is, the more the metrics push out expertise. Okay. Here's another argument. This is a variation. This may actually be the same argument as the expertise argument. I can't quite tell. So longstanding communities often develop shared reasons that aren't available to those outside the community. Call these intimate reasons. Properly assessing intimate reasons often requires long familiarity with a particular context or a long history of shared communal deliberation. Both expert transparency and public transparency undermine the use of shared developed reasoning. So one way you can put it is that transparency undermines the intimate reasoning of communities. So what are examples of intimate reasons? Some of them are more aesthetic, like I think a philosopher's sense of interesting questions, an aesthetic sense of good flow and rap, or a sense of cool and skateboard tricks. But in the political and social sphere, I think there are a lot of theories that plausibly think that oppressed communities and marginalized communities have better understandings of the power and weight of certain considerations based on their experience. So an oppressed community sense of which terms are and aren't demeaning, or which acts of cultural appropriation are and aren't permissible. So intimate reasons would exist if they're only convincing to those who have had some experience. And a lot of those, some of those are aesthetic, but I think a lot of those experiences are, say, living under a particular form of oppression. So sometimes I think people usually imagine that transparency is always corrupt political figures and the transparency is conducted by a good and competent public. But a lot of the times, I think, in my experience, like half the time, it's flipped. Sometimes you have transparency over a well-intentioned minority advocacy group conducted by an insensitive set of public representatives or the rushed public. This example is quite biographical. I watched at my last university an LGBTQ support group try to be transparent to the Utah State Legislature and the Utah Board of Trustees, who had very little experience with the experience of being LGBTQ in Utah. And in particular, what happened was budgetary requests that were tied to the concept of safe spaces were all rejected, right? And I think there's a weird logic here, because the reason you set up an LGBTQ support group and staff it with people who've experienced being LGBTQ in Utah is because you think having that experience gives you some special understanding. But the demand for public transparency, insofar as it has authority, undermines the application of that special understanding. Let's get forward to it. So let me step back. Big picture. So there's a tension between transparency practices and the respect for expertise. One way to put it, I think, is that there's this long-time standard of intellectual autonomy, which expects people to be able to evaluate everything for themselves that they come in contact with. And we now know this to be a fantasy. My favorite expression of this is in the philosopher Elijah Milgram's book, The Great Endarkment, which suggests that intellectual autonomy is kind of an outmoded principle that made sense during the Great Enlightenment, and where all of human knowledge could fit in one human brain. But when we have the degree of specialization we have now, intellectual autonomy is not possible. And my worry is that transparency practice takes the fantasy of intellectual autonomy and writes it into policy. It expects us to be able to quickly evaluate any domain of our own accord. And I think that demand falls apart with any respect for deep expertise. So here's a second thought. There's a view that all reason should be public, accessible to anybody. And one way to think is that this is in profound tension with the lessons of standpoint epistemology. So for those that I think are outside a certain branch of humanities, standpoint epistemology is the set of theories that thinks a particular standpoint on the world, in particular, say, living under a particular kind of oppression or marginalization, gives you special understanding of certain features of the world and certain reasons. So if you this is, by the way, for the philosophers and humanities people in the room, this is this thing that I didn't understand until I articulated to myself, that many progressives and leftists have two commitments that I now think can't easily stand comfortably together. One is a commitment to public transparency, and another is a commitment to standpoint epistemology and the special understanding of oppressed groups. Those are in tension. Okay. I'm gonna try to calm myself down and have some coffee. Okay, go to the main argument. Now I'm gonna look at some objections and big pictures. That's the substance. So one thing you might think is that, doesn't the public have the right to control what they fund? So let's narrow down for the moment to publicly funded cases, like publicly funded science research, arts grants, academics at public schools. Philip Kitcher, a philosopher of science, in Science, Truth, and Democracy, argues against the view that scientists should be able to guide their own research by their own values. He's particularly interested in scientists using public funding to chase esoteric projects instead of doing more kind of grounded applied research. And his view is that there isn't some clear value to all of science, like pure understanding. There's only different projects guided by different values. And insofar as the public funds science, they should set those values. So he often said, like, yes, publicly funded science should prioritize medical research over incredibly abstract research. So here's a counter proposal to everything I've said. Okay, let's accept that we should get rid of deliberative transparency, but what about outcome transparency? Doctors use all kinds of complex reasoning, but the outcomes are health and well-being, and that's publicly available. So maybe expertise should be applied as the means, but insofar as the expert is in the service of the public, they should pursue the public conception of the good. So maybe the public should set the outcomes, and the expertise can be applied to the means. But I'm worried about this. So let me give you an example. This is from Jennifer Lena's Entitled. Jennifer Lena is a wonderful sociologist of arts culture, and Entitled is a history of divisions in the art world as told through a history of arts funding in America. And what she says is that when the National Endowment of the Arts was under the direct purview of Congress, Congress people accused the NEA of pork barreling and corruption because the NEA kept funding weird shit that Congress people didn't see why it was art. And Congress's justification was that many of the funded projects were flops. That is, they didn't make much money. What this reveals is presumption in Congress that valuable art will always make money, that's the value or a reliable criteria of value in art. I think what this shows is that in many cases, the value of an activity or endeavor is more evident to people with experience and expertise in that value. So the assumption behind the counterproposal is that expertise is instrumental, but the proper targets in a domain, the values, are available to non-experts. But I think what this example suggests is that in many cases, expertise is required to see what's really valuable. You could call this the expert ladenness of value, if you wanted to be a cute philosopher of science. So the best articulation of this concept I find in Tal Brewer's wonderful book, The Retrieval of Ethics. And what he says is it takes a long involvement in activity to really see its value. So for me, I think a lot about, so I was a super sedentary youth, and I despised the idea of exercise. And for a long time, I thought exercise had one goal: burn calories, look thinner. It took me years with exercise to realize that's bullshit. I exercise because it's beautiful, because it sets my mind at ease, because the movement of my body in and of itself is a wonderful thing, because of all kinds of things. But from the outside, before doing it, I thought it was just to burn calories, right? What Brewer actually thinks is you engage in something he calls a dialectical process, where you do an activity, you have a simple notion of a value, you do the activity under that value, and then that changes your conception of the value, and it enriches it, and you pick up that new target, and that changes how you do the activity, and then that shows you even more deeply the complexity of the value of the activity. So what do you do about case of this in public funding? So one possibility is, as Kitcher suggests, that we think that the experts, some people think that the experts should set the desired outcome all on their own. This is generally considered a bad idea. But another possibility is the public sets the outcome in some general way, and the expert fills out the full nature of that outcome. So I want to specify two different relationships you could have to public set outcomes. One is value handoff. The public specifies value in general, like education or understanding, and the expert fills out the details. The second option is what you can call direct output transparency. The public specifies and picks the exact metric by which success is measured. As you can probably guess, I think option 2 is liable to the problem I've been talking about, where the non-expert will misunderstand what makes a good judgment. So direct output transparency. So I have an early paper on this called Cognitive Islands and Runaway Echo Chambers, where I worry that direct output transparency only works in those domains in which it is a clear litmus test. So a litmus test is an assessment of an output that's available to a non-expert. So bridge building, bridge engineering might be a domain with a litmus test because non-experts can tell whether a bridge falls down or not. I just say I'm not even arguing with my past self. I'm not even sure about this because a lot of the times I think if the bridge is built, non-experts can't easily tell whether it's a good bridge or not. That's a much more complex matter. But I think there's a significant problem, even if you accept that, with false litmus tests, where the non-expert, because of their inexpertise, thinks they have a good litmus test. So example is a throughput metric. Another one of my favorites is the red wine versus white wine thing. So there are all these scientific studies saying that wine experts don't know shit because they can't tell red wine from white wine. But thinking that red wine versus white wine is a good test is itself a sign of inexpertise, and the simple thought that all white wines are like this and all red wines are like that. Because as it turns out, there are actually many white wines that are thick, oaky, and powerful, like oaked Viogniers, and there are often a lot of red wines that are thin and crisp and sour, like certain cold climate Pinots and Northern Italian ones. So thinking that this is clear is itself, thinking that this is a good way to test wine experts is itself a sign of non-expertise. I think another one that a lot of us live under is the idea that education has value insofar as it leads to a good salary. So here's another way to put it. There might be a reliable test for expertise, but direct output transparency requires that non-experts properly identify the litmus test. But that just pushes the expert identification problem from one step up. Instead of having non-experts identify the experts, now they have to identify the test that identifies the experts. But what I've tried to show is the same problem recurs. If you can't figure out who the experts are, then you can't figure out what the right test is for the experts. And the second problem, I think this is an even deeper one, is the magnetism of clear litmus tests. So I'm actually worried that in the long run, activities might be reformulated around available litmus tests. For example, that medicine might become more oriented towards measurable outcomes, like saving lives and increasing lifespan, over less measurable ones, like more complex notions of well-being, or that education will become oriented around measurable ones, like standardized test scores and employment rates and satisfaction surveys, instead of less measurable ones, like wisdom and the cultivation of virtue. So a thing that happened once, I was talking through this stuff, and one of my students raises their hand from the back of the room, and they said, well, what about exercising? I mean, the point of it is weight loss, and that's measurable. So if it's already got a measurable outcome, what are we losing? And I was like, how did we get to the point where we thought the point of physical activity was weight loss? That already seems like the activity has become reformulated around a handy litmus test. Grand finale. So I think a way to sum up everything I've said is that transparency is a form of surveillance. And I don't mean to say, as some other people do, that it's surveillance, therefore bad, full stop. Surveillance is, according to the standard definition in the ethics of surveillance, is heightened attention paid because of the possibility of bad action. I want to say that transparency is a particular kind of surveillance. It's bureaucratic surveillance. It's monitoring activities to make sure they're appropriately justified instead of time wasters, corrupt, bias, subject to mission drift. So in general, surveillance destroys intimacy and privacy and creates paranoia. Bureaucratic surveillance destroys the possibility of intimacy and creates a paranoia of justification, a sense that you might have to justify anything you do to someone with no context and no sympathy looking over your shoulder. Something we talk about in Q&A, by the way, that I didn't get to talk about much here, is that if you look at the sociology of bureaucracy, one of the essential ideas is the logic of bureaucracy centers around the decontextualization of information. That information, in order to work well, bureaucracy can handle those kinds of information that can travel well through very different layers in very different people. And so it requires information be stripped of subtlety and nuance and to be reduced to some invariant kernel that can easily travel between different bureaucratic layers. We can talk about that more. That's cool stuff from sociology. So the worry is that when you internalize this, you'll restrict yourself to those actions which you could justify towards some kind of internally decontextualized overseer. By the way, I think a lot of this reasoning is revealed when we use the term best practices in the university. Sorry, sorry. I didn't mean to say that. No, I did, but I didn't. Okay, so in general, the thought is that surveillance can be occasionally justified, but it has a high price. So from the literature on the ethics of surveillance, surveillance is only justified in proportion to the probability of wrongdoing and the degree of consequence. You shouldn't just surveil everybody all the time. And my worry is that the current institutional culture is moving towards surveillance of everything all the time. This is it. This is the big picture of the whole talk. So my worry is that there is a realm that is hidden from public oversight where bias hides and corruption flourishes, and that very same realm is where expert skills reside, and sensitivity flourishes, and intimacy lives, and transparency destroys all of it. It's very rough medicine. It's like soul chemo or something. Sorry, I need more coffee. The current tendency is to treat transparency as totally good and think the more the better. I think what we should actually think is that transparency is a very intrusive form of bureaucratic surveillance which profoundly limits expertise, and we need it to expose bias and corruption, but we also often need to trust and not demand transparency in order to let expertise, sensitivity, and intimacy flourish. So here's another way to put it. The world is incredibly hyper-specialized, and most domains of expertise are not available to most people. So we need to trust, but because of the inaccessibility problem, we can't fully secure that trust. We can't be perfectly sure we're trusting the right people. As Annette Beyer, the great philosopher of trust, puts it, trust by its nature puts us into a position of essential vulnerability. So one thing you can try to do is to eliminate this vulnerability, to rein your experts in from out of your sight. But if you do so using transparency, then you impose on them a limitation of being justificatorily understood by non-experts. And to that degree, you limit their expertise. So, what's the solution? There's no solution. So, I think what this shows us is the tension between trust and transparency is an essential one that arises from the hyper-specialized nature of human knowledge, right? The fact that we are limited beings have to trust each other just puts us in this condition of vulnerability. And to the degree that you try to get rid of vulnerability, you also get rid of the power of trusting experts. So there's just a slider between trust and transparency. In each situation, we get to choose where that slider goes. And in every situation, we have to make a painful compromise between trust and transparency. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Thi. That was wonderful. Really, really enjoyable and provocative. I'm sure many people in the audience have questions. And if you do have a question, don't hesitate to put up your Zoom hand. Maybe we can start by calling on the real positivist. I'm not sure who that is. That's somebody.
So my name.
Guest.
Yeah, I had another meeting where it was related to a Vienna Circle kind of aficionado group, and that was sorry, I just forgot to change it. So
I thought for a second you might be Liam Cuffey Bryant, who goes also by the last.
No, he's the last positivist. Yeah, but I don't think he's positivist enough. I know.
Oh, okay.
Okay. Yeah, I don't think he's.
So Rudolf Carnap, over to you.
Yeah. But it's a good segue because the Vienna Circle was very much concerned with making public claims of knowledge transparent. A bit of a different social context that they had versus RST. I don't know if you remember me. So I did my master's at Utah. You were at UVU. And we had a number of, you would come and give talks, and I would see you in various coffee shops. And I was good friends with Lucas. Remember Lucas?
Yep, remember Lucas.
Yeah. So I really enjoyed your talk, right? So, and I know I enjoyed it because there's so much I agree with you, and there's so much I really disagree with you, right? And I even went so far as to read your paper. It's like, 50 plus pages, which I enjoyed. And there are two kind of main points I want to bring up. One is you have to kind of address in what you do, but in a footnote, right? The wisdom of the crowd thesis, right? And you cite this Helen Lansdowne and some of her work. And in your main arguments, you have a suppressed premise, which I think you need to make clear. So the anthematic premise is that all the relevant experts are over here, and the public contains none of those experts. Because if we take the wisdom of the crowd thesis seriously, the crowd is wiser than any particular individual. And if that crowd contains experts or a sufficient degree of expertise, then it seems, and I think empirically, and I think the theoretical reasons to think that public is going to be wiser than even the experts producing the scientific. So I think there's that going on. Another is, so my own dissertation on quantifying uncertainty within the
Actually, just a second. If I can interject, let's let Thi answer that first question, and then maybe we'll see if we have time to go on to the second one.
Thanks.
Good, thank you.
By the way, thanks for the mention. I just popped into the chat. This paper is out, although it's going to be part of a book, so it's going to change, but I just dropped a link to the archive version. Yeah, so what you're talking about is another 10,000 words I cut out of this paper. So a lot of this is going to depend on whether or not you believe in the wisdom of the crowds. So first of all, I am not claiming that all the experts over here and all the non-experts over here. The worry is that any large-scale group, the experts will be drowned out by the non-experts. So, I mean, if we're all together and we're going to vote, right? Climate change experts get to vote in the US, but their views don't rise to the top. So a lot of this depends on the way in which the intelligence in a crowd is aggregated. So famously, one of my favorite defenses for the wisdom of crowds is Helen Landamore's book, Democratic Reason. And one of her views is what you're going to do is you're going to get a bunch of people deliberating together, and they're going to proffer all the reasons. And because you have a crowd, you're going to have an incredibly large variety of reasons. You'll search out all the information. And then we're going to aggregate that and vote, and all the good reasons will rise to the top. And this is the thing that I'm particularly worried about, because I think a suppressed premise in Landamore's argument is the presumption that good reasons will rise to the top in a case of public deliberation. So the worry is that insofar as the voting technique aggregates is a general aggregate, you won't get that because the most people are non-expert and are non-expert. There is this really interesting rich empirical domain of study about the wisdom of crowds thesis. And in particular, a lot of the stuff that I find really interesting says that, like, so take a startup. If you have a really large diversity of people, then things tend to rise to the top. But those studies typically look to me like they're done on single domains of expertise. So you get a bunch of computer scientists or a bunch of business people who all have the same expertise are making a decision in that area. And then they have to reason. It does look like the relevant reason rises to the top. So you could get around this if you could somehow create an aggregative procedure where you manage to get the right expert in charge of each domain so they could pick out what the right reason was. But how do you do that if you don't have a good public expert detection procedure? So basically, the claim is that aggregation, we don't have a good way to aggregate a very large diversity of views where the key information is understood by experts such that the public will pick the expert problem. The right experts and the right views. In the background, by the way, one of my big worries is that this is a scale problem. And a lot of the really convincing studies on how groups deliberate well together are done on smaller scale groups. And if you buy a lot of the arguments from the sociology of bureaucracy, a lot of that capacity changes when you scale up the information collection procedure for the reasons that I gave.
Great.
Right, thank you, Thi.
Thanks.
Now let's forego my other one. Yeah.
Okay, great. Can I call on Michael Inslicht?
Yes. Hi. I really enjoyed the talk.
Good to see you.
Yes, and hi, Jennifer. We met years ago. I'm not sure you remember.
I remember.
All right, excellent. So I was really curious to hear your talk. I know you from a podcast, Decoding the Gurus, where you have a side interest in other things. I know, but I'll keep my question to this talk. I think it actually really follows up the last question, which is, I wonder if you're giving too much credit to experts. Okay, because experts are wrong sometimes. So I'm a psychologist. I'm really, really active in the open science movement. And like part of what I say, I just had a lecture, a 2-hour lecture on how psychology was wrong for decades and might still be wrong. So experts are wrong sometimes. Sometimes we don't realize we're wrong. Like, so for example, on an intuitive level, for example, when we select candidates for a job or for graduate school or what have you, we might think we have the best intuition as experts in our field about who to hire. It turns out, like when we use, for example, interviews, it turns out, are a terrible way to evaluate candidates. You pick up certain qualities only, like whether they're talkative and extroverted. Maybe that's relevant for being a salesperson, but might not be valuable for being a thoughtful graduate student. So experts are often wrong, or sometimes wrong. And then there's a related concept, which is that sometimes experts are out to protect their guild, right? They're trying to preserve their own existence. So back in the day when people studied phlogiston, maybe there's a phlogiston society out there to maintain the existence of the basic element of phlogiston, and you can't go over what the experts say. So how does, and by the way, I like your argument. I see it as you're weighing the pros and cons. You're just trying to alert us to a negative. So I get that, but I'm just trying to pick a little bit of one aspect, which is like what happened when experts are wrong or trying to be self-protective.
Right. Okay, this is a great question. So the quick, tiny, boring defensive answer is the paper is an argument that the power of experts, one way you can put it is, if experts have any increased reliability, transparency undermines it. So if they don't, there's no reason to not be transparent. I just don't think that's true. And I don't think that any of us actually can, I actually have a slightly cynical take on some of this. I think that there's a lot of, it is very easy to get behind expert discrediting arguments, but that's not how we live our lives. That's not how I go to the doctor when I'm sick and take a COVID vaccine. Like, that's not why I took the COVID vaccine. That's not why I'm taking antibiotics right now. That's not why I take my car to the mechanic, right? I think our lives are basically informed, and we know that our lives in the era of the sciences depends on trust in experts. The argument doesn't require that experts always be right. It just requires that there's a better reason that experts are more often right than non-experts, right? So the fact that experts can be wrong. But I think what you're touching on is something really deep, and it's the reason we actually need transparency, right? If I didn't believe any of what you're saying, I'd be like, fuck transparency, let experts reign. But actually, I think we have a huge amount of evidence that there is an enormous amount of mission drift, that experts do a lot of stuff that is for guild protection, right? And my worry is that because of the structure of specialized knowledge, we don't have a perfect way to rein that in. That everything we do to rein that in also has a price. So if it helps, the place I got started on this, and actually the place that I started, right, I'm not sure if Jennifer, I might have told you this before, the place I got started thinking about echo chambers in general was not the political case, but the aesthetic case. I was interested in the question of whether you could tell a group of genuine experts who were into something that you didn't get from a group of poser hipsters who'd made up a fake thing. Right. And I think one of the interesting things, it's really hard to tell. I actually spent a lot of my life thinking that jazz people are a bunch of hipster turds. And then one day I got John Coltrane and my brain fell to pieces. And right. And I think there's a similar thing. It's very easy to discredit the wine world from the outside because it's actually incredibly hard to tell. And so my worry is there is a genuine possibility. Here's the structure of the worry. There's a genuine possibility that experts have drifted or are corrupt. But also, the way to evaluate that itself requires expertise. And that puts us in a deep dilemma that there's not an easy way out of. I mean, the whole point is that what we're involved in right now for the last few hundred years is this weird enterprise where in order to function with science, we have to march forward with the need to trust experts and without the ability to secure it. And that just puts us in this weird position.
Yeah, here we are. Thanks for that, T. Can I call on Julio Cesar Leite? Julio, you're muted right now.
Hi, thanks for your
Hi.
talk. Really interesting. I came from a different crowd. I'm from requirements engineering, which is a subfield of computer science. And we've been studying transparency related to soft for some time now. So we did work on trying to understand what is transparency, how it relates to trust, how it relates to ethics. What caught my attention was the fact that you centered your arguments about transparency on an intermediary. You put the expert between the ones who are going to receive the information and the provider of the information, who necessarily don't need to be an entity as an actor, a real agent, right? It could be an organization, and as such, may have different viewpoints established in a document, for instance. So why the focus on experts and how this contributes to transparency somehow? This would be my question.
Hold on, I'm not sure I fully understand. Let me take a stab, and you can tell me whether I got your question. All right. So there are two issues. One is the problem of the question of why we concentrate on individual experts versus institutions. I'm actually not sure there's a difference in kind between that, because if you set up institutions, we have the same problem about being able to distinguish between corrupt institutions and non-corrupt institutions, biased institutions versus non-biased institutions. The question about intermediaries is a really interesting one, and I think your characterization of my view I didn't recognize. So the talk I gave was specifically about the problem of a non-expert recognizing an expert without an intermediary.
Right.
Right. So a further question is, why not get intermediaries? And my worry is, and this is in the paper version, my worry is the intermediaries are subject to the same problem. So the best example I know is a study of pharmaceutical regulators. So you have those of us who aren't part of the pharmaceutical industry, who both believe in science and also are suspicious of profit motivations. Then you have the pharmaceutical industry. And now we think what we need to do is set up regulators who aren't part of the pharmaceutical industry, but have the expertise, and we just trust them. But the worry becomes whether they are appropriate bearers of our trust. So there's this concept that I got really excited by called regulatory capture. So regulatory capture happens when the regulators' interests become more aligned with those that they're regulating than the public. So in the pharmaceutical case, it often happens because A, regulators spend more time hanging out with pharmaceutical companies, but B, and I found this terrifying, it turns out when you retire from a government pharmaceutical regulating job, the most likely scenario is that you become a consultant to or an employee at a pharmaceutical company who's very highly paid, whose job is to interact with regulators. And so, as a matter of fact, out of the sight of the public, most of the public, regulators have their incentives. Regulators' incentives can be captured by those that they're supposed to regulate. So how are we supposed to monitor that? And so the worry is something like, if you have an expert and a non-expert and you place an intermediary between them, a regulator or a regulatory institution, now we have the problem of setting up trust for the regulatory institution.
Okay, but why you frame transparency between non-experts and experts, not necessarily transparencies between experts and non-experts?
Oh yeah,
that's
so
the point.
That's not the topic of the paper. The paper is about public to. This is a study in transparency between experts and non-experts. Different issues arise for expert transparency.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Can I call on Cameron Yetman? Hey, Cameron, good to see you.
Yeah, you too. Yeah, thanks. That was really, really compelling. I don't know exactly how to frame this question, but you sort of briefly mentioned something that I feel like made explicit something that was sort of inchoate in me for a little while, which was about this tension among, I think you used the word progressives, between standpoint epistemology and like placing a high value on public transparency. And I think this is something that came out, especially for me, in light of the like Black Lives Matter protests in 2020, where protesters were sort of they were giving reasons for their behavior that made reference to their like things which within the community were quite well known. So like intimate reasons for action, things about police brutality and sort of the experiences of the community. And I think there were progressive people who felt like they didn't understand those reasons, or seemingly progressive people who felt like they didn't understand those reasons, and so it was hard to get behind the actions of the protesters. And sort of one of my default responses is to just think, well, basically we should employ a kind of blind empathy or blind trust in communities which have this kind of intimate experience. But I guess doing so means you're getting rid of the requirement for transparency if it's a kind of blind. So do you think this is the correct kind of response for somebody who's not part of a given community to take towards the actions or the reasons or justifications of that community?
Yeah, this paper, by the way, is written very much in the aftermath of Black Lives Matter, and also my teaching about it in front of an audience of ethics students who were mostly Fox News listeners. So that's a lot of what's going on is feeling that on a daily basis. I don't. So yeah, the tension you're pointing out is just something that I find very important and very worrisome. Again, because the whole point of standpoint is that, I mean, the epistemic power of trust is it lets us leverage viewpoints and lives that aren't our own, right? That's the whole point of trust. The worry, but my basic instant response for all of this is, given the complexity of every issue, it seems very unlikely that at any point the right solution is to solve for all transparency or all trust, right? If you're all transparency, you're undermining expertise fully. If you're all trust, your door is entirely open to corruption, to bias. And I mean, any such thing can be gamed. I mean, this is something Olafemi Taiwo and I talk a lot about in the connection between thinking about value capture and elite capture. If you have a strategy that looks like something like this, any member of any oppressed group, I will completely trust in any domain that's gameable, that's abusable, right? So I don't, in some sense, I don't know what the right answer here is. Something going to be in the realm is going to be something in the realm of we muddle through, and we can't solve perfectly for either of the things we want, and so depending on the weight of the consequences and the degree to which we think, I mean, so in the background, there's a big question for me that's incredibly hard to solve, which is how we judge which people are trustworthy. This is already hard enough on the interpersonal level, and then in many cases we need to do it on the institutional level towards distant actors. And in some sense, maybe part of the background is, for the philosophers, I kind of think that's the central question of epistemology, or should be. How we manage trust when the object of our trust often has to act in ways that exceed our understanding. And I think there are a lot of attempts that look like easy solves. All transparency is an easy solve, and blind trust is an easy solve, and I don't think either will work. So I don't know. That should be a central research project for all epistemologists, or a lot of them, or some of us.
Yeah, lots to think about. Thanks.
Yeah, well, we'll get right on that too.
Thanks.
That's a tough one though, right? Can I call on Sam Lesker?
Hi, thank you for the talk. Very interesting stuff. I wonder if there is one factor which might mitigate the harm, which is the difference in difficulty between finding a solution and checking whether a solution works. So what's the square root of 169? Fairly difficult. Is 13 the square root of 169? Easier. So this seems to be quite a general discrepancy that holds across a wide range of domains. I think it's what underlies the conjecture that P doesn't equal NP in math. So I wonder if one would expect coming up with reasons for a given verdict to be much harder in general than evaluating whether given reasons are legitimate. There's probably still a significant problem because you still need a degree of expertise to check the solution.
Right.
But I wonder if it helps that then we could expect there to be less expertise to be required.
Yeah. So this is exactly the part that I called direct output transparency and litmus tests. So if a domain has a litmus test where there's an outcome whose success is checkable by a non-expert, then this problem doesn't obtain. I think that's a really limited realm. So I think there are a lot of, so interestingly, so originally when I wrote, way back when I wrote this paper called Cognitive Islands, and I divided the space into litmus test and non-litmus test. And I said something that I don't believe in now. Back then I said, look, the moral realm and the aesthetic realm, those have no litmus test, right? So the moral realm is I think a really compelling case, right? Like, how do you figure out who to trust morally? If you're checking for who to trust by judging their judgments, then you're going to engage your own moral sensibilities. And if you're a morally crappy person, you're going to choose morally crappy experts, right? White supremacists are going to choose white supremacists. Back then, I said something like, look, the sciences, on the other hand, the sciences are okay. They're fine because they're direct outputs, like building bridges, and then all the sciences are hooked up. So Philip Kitcher called this indirect calibration. Even if your science is like theoretical physics, even if it isn't, even if it doesn't have a direct output, it's hooked up through a chain of connection. So the sciences were fine. I've come to become much more doubtful about that. And part of that is just having lived through a decade of watching climate change denial and anti-vaxxing. And I do think that any optimistic theory in the space of expert recognition has to deal with that empirical reality. So what I think now is two things. One, in order to make the judgments, you need to understand a lot about the sciences to see which ones link and which ones don't link, because there are a lot of poser sciences that claim that they link in. So I used to live in Hollywood near the Scientology Center for Psychiatry, which is an alternate institution that has crappy science, but makes claims and claims that it's hooked up into the main body of science. The other problem is that even what we think of as very, very close to ground empirical sciences, the judgments of whether or not they're successful are actually quite expert laden. For example, the efficacy of vaccines, right? That's not something that you can just show to somebody. That even judging that outcome requires a fair amount of statistical sophistication that, I mean, I don't even have it, right? I have a PhD. I'm not like, I have a PhD. I can't judge statistics for shit. Like that's, right? And the last example, even examples, what I had thought in the past were incredibly plain examples, like, oh, bridge engineering, there's something that's really easy for the public to judge. Insofar as the judgment, we don't get to judge bridges, jump forward in time and look how they performed for 200 years, right? We have to make judgments at the moment. And even in what I take to be the plainest cases, the judgment seems, I mean, we can tell abject failures, like bridges that fall down immediately, but the difference between a bridge that's going to last for 5 years and the one that's 30 is actually itself fairly expert laden. So again, it's a degree to which the good outcome is publicly accessible, and that's going to be quite variable. But I think in a lot of cases, it's easy to underestimate the amount of expertise required to judge what counts as a good outcome.
Thanks for that. I have Matthew Veliket next on the list.
Hi,
Matthew,
can you hear
hey.
me?
Yeah.
Yes, we can. Go ahead.
Okay, great. Thank you for that presentation. I really enjoyed that. So I'm going to try to structure my thought the best I can. It's still maybe a little incoherent, but I was originally surprised by the fact that you chose the word transparency for this presentation, as transparency is a form of surveillance, because I see transparency as something that tends to connote some form of candidness, some form of honesty, which then kind of leads me to think that answering the question, which experts should we trust, as a non-expert who doesn't really have the same level of knowledge, could be resolved by, I'm speaking more from personal experience, but experts who are willing to concede what they don't know, and that are willing to kind of display a certain level of humility and the questions that they don't have answers to. And I feel like that is still a form of transparency, in that, they're being honest, and, being humble to a certain extent. And I feel like that could be a good way of looking at who to trust, who versus not to trust, especially it's difficult because I think, there's this expectation that experts will have answers to all the kind of questions that are out there, or at least in their field of specialization. So I guess I'm wondering if you could expand on why you chose transparency specifically as a word for this presentation,
right,
and not something like, accountability or
right,
some other kind of word that you could use.
So transparency is, so the reason I use that term is just that that's the standard term in institutional language. Transparency and accountability are usually separated. So transparency is the making available of information, and accountability is usually the capacity to impose sanctions. So they normally go together. But the claim that I'm making, I think you could make the claim, it is easier to make the claim that accountability here is problematic, but I'm claiming that transparency in and of itself creates the surveillance effect, right? So merely making information available. So that's why. The rest of your question, though, for me is about kind of the deepest part of this issue, and something that I've been torn about for a really long time, which is, are there general qualities of expertise that are generally recognizable? So there, in Annette Byer's original version, an original account of trust, she had this account where what was to trust was to say that, to believe that someone had goodwill. That meant what you were trusting was a unified quality, and if you could identify goodwill, you could figure out who to trust. That makes for a fairly optimistic picture, because you just find people with goodwill. Unfortunately, I was persuaded away from this by Onora O'Neill, who points out that in many cases, reliable experts don't have goodwill at all. Right? That people are often reliable as experts, even though they're cranky, they don't give a crap about you. There are lots of reasons that people are reliable, and they don't. Surely we don't think that every expert is a kind, good person, which is what you might have thought. So now you say, okay, let's switch to certain intellectually virtuous characters, like humility, open-mindedness, all this stuff. Why can't we use that to identify experts? The first place I ever stumbled onto this problem of the identification of experts to non-experts was a bunch of empirical papers about juries' capacity to identify real expert witnesses. And it turns out, reliably, juries are shit at identifying genuine expert witnesses. Expert witnesses are, real experts are often careful, cautious, a little bit unclear, and kind of hired gun poor experts in the legal world make clear declamatory statements and stand by their guns. So now my worry is, and this is actually something I don't know how to resolve. So one possibility is that there are genuine correlates of expertise, but recognize them as such is also something of an expert matter. Right? You need to spend a lot of time with a certain kind of expert. The other, is it actually true that experts that are trustworthy are reliably open-minded, is this like, I mean, I feel like that there's a low correlation between, I don't know, medical experts and that kind of quality, right? Or I don't think actually a decision procedure for figuring out which mechanic to pick to fork in my car is to look for the one that's open-minded and humble. So I actually am genuinely unsure. I think the things that you're talking about are highly but not perfectly correlated with a very narrow band of experts, but they don't seem to correlate across the board. But that if there's a solution to this, it would be wonderful if we could find generally recognizable intellectual qualities that anyone could recognize that universally correlated with expertise. I just really doubt those exist.
Alas, alas. Okay.
Let me say one more thing.
Wait.
One more thing.
Yeah, go for it.
Even if that is findable, the plausible ones I think are recognizable interpersonally. I think it might be the case that I could, after spending a few days with someone, recognize them to have intellectually virtuous characteristics based on one-to-one interaction. The question is how one scales that up institutionally. And I have no idea how you set up an institutional procedure for picking at a distance which experts have this complex, subtle virtue of humility and open-mindedness.
Yeah, that does sound tough, to be sure. We've got just 3 minutes left, so I think this next question probably could be our last in the official Q&A. So Tushar Chaturvedi,
yeah.
If you're there. Yeah, hi. Go ahead.
Hi, actually my camera is not working, so sorry for that. Yeah. So I have 2 or 3 interrelated questions. The first is that, see, what if hello, am I audible?
Yes, just audible, but I think we've got 2 minutes left. So if you've got 2 or 3 questions, let's just go with one of them.
Okay. I'll boil them down. What if public transparency, yields a very different kind of expertise where, public reason is crafted by certain objective values and at the same time it's morally upright. The second question is that, the relata of this trust and transparency relationship are people. But I think the essential tension is between epistemic responsibility and the right of an expert. So now in the modern time, expertise is being relegated to AI tools and very complex algorithms. So how would your transparency versus trust debate accommodate this growing concern?
So I didn't hear all the question because your audio is breaking up a bit, but let me try to answer what I understood. I think the first part of the question is a similar answer. The first part of the question is a proposal: what if we center moral trustworthiness? And for me, that is actually the hardest of all the problems because it requires the identification of moral trustworthiness. I think is itself something that requires a substantial amount of moral sensitivity to identify, and then you'll get these kinds of looping misidentifications. I think the last part of your question was about machine learning systems, and I noticed that Sheila asked a similar question. I have to be frank, I have no idea how this applies to problems in machine learning. I once took a stab at it and realized I know so little about machine learning. One thing that I could talk, if we had more time, I would talk about is, I think part of the structure, one of the lessons from the sociology of quantification is that large-scale data collection efforts do have to have inputs that are relatively free of the requirement for contextual sensitivity or expert nuance and sensitivity. And so anything that goes into the data set, the original training data set, has to be that, because it's subject to institutional scale collection constraints, has to be kind of cleansed of kind of peculiar and sensitive awareness. That might be a problem or it might not, but I think this is something that I don't have the expertise to answer.
Thank you.
So thank you for that. And I'm looking at the clock, and alas, it's 4:30 now. And so I just want to say thank you very much, Thi, for taking the time to join us. Always so intellectually exciting to hear from you. And so please join me in thanking Thi for an excellent presentation. And we really appreciate you taking this time. Please join us next week for a talk by Moshe Vardi, who is a professor of computational engineering at Rice University and senior editor of communications of the ACM. He'll be talking about principles that computer scientists can use to develop an ethical framework for their practices. So we look forward to seeing you next Wednesday at 3:10 p.m. And thanks everybody for coming out and hearing Thi Nguyen. And once again, I recommend his book, Games, Agency as Art. Very much worth checking out. So thanks, Thi.
Thanks, everybody.
Take care.